In certain parts of the world, they say that upgrades are overrated, but they don't say that in Texas. For the 2023 United States Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas in Austin, Texas, Haas did something that they haven't done for a very long time. They upgraded their car. And what an upgrade package it is. The American-owned team, Italian-built car came to the track with a completely new look. And I'm not just talking about the stars and stripes paint job. This car is following a very different concept to the one it started the season with. And a lot of people in the media have said the Haas now is a bit of a Red Bull clone, particularly at the rear of the car. Well, I've had a look at this and I don't think that's really true. I think people are kind of not telling the full story there, or they haven't really looked at the car properly. And I have heard Gunther Steiner's comments, but I think he might not be talking about the same areas of the car that everybody thinks he is. And you can really see this by looking at the back of the Red Bull. This is a shot taken earlier this weekend in the pit lane at Austin. And you can see the very distinctive rear shape of the Red Bull. You've got the very sticky outy side pod, and you've got that just very distinctive Red Bull shape with those very lovely little creases, which almost remind me of a marine life form at the front of the side pod there. When you take a look at that shape of car, then take a look at the shape of the modified Haas, well, they're not especially similar when you look from one to the other, are they? You can see the Haas has got very deeply sculpted side pods here, big gullies in the side. You've got these massive cooling louvres, and I know teams swap them around through the season and depending on the conditions, but this is a really very different side pod shape to that used by Red Bull. And to understand how Haas have got to this point, you first need to understand a little bit about the Haas Formula One team and how they develop their cars. Haas is pretty much unique in Formula One, though a few teams are going a little bit closer to the Haas model in future seasons, I hear. Haas came into Formula One deciding to build as little as possible as the rules allowed. So they buy as much of the car as possible from Ferrari. It's the suspension, the gearbox, the engine, but also everything that isn't essentially an aerodynamic part comes lock, stock and barrel from Maranello. So the Haas, by definition, will generally follow the Ferrari concept. And if we look back to the 2022 season, Ferrari had a very distinctive car. The F122 introduced these beautiful and very distinctive soap dish style sculpted side pods. That was all to do with managing the airflow over the body of the car and around and for the cooling system, and it reduced the drag of the package overall. And this was a really effective solution, so effective that Ferrari essentially kept it for 2023, slightly modified form, but the concept was all of the same. And a lot of teams actually copied these shapes, if not the exact concept, when they saw what Ferrari had done and worked out that it was a drag-reducing solution. And actually, it was a bunch of students who first worked this out, and they put a rough-shaped model of an F1 car with this shaped side pod into some CFD and came up with a pretty clear result. Ferrari then confirmed the work of the students, which was wonderful to see that they'd got it pretty much right, even though the details weren't exactly there. So it was no great surprise to see during the 2022 season, Haas, which didn't start off with this sort of soap dish style concept, they later in the season copied this design, very much the same as Ferrari. Not a great surprise, same power unit, all the same bits and pieces under the bodywork. Of course, Haas is going to follow Ferrari, and they openly admitted they looked at the Ferrari, copied the concept, because why wouldn't you? It's very clear to do. And the Haas design was very much a Ferrari-inspired clone. You could very clearly see those white and red cars were just white versions of the red cars. Things are a bit different in 2023 though, because Ferrari have sort of moved away from their own concept. This is how they started the season, that very distinctive concept we saw from early on. But in the Spanish Grand Prix, Ferrari introduced a completely new side pod concept. A little bit of a gully forming in that section, but a very different side pod shape. So when I heard that Haas were going to change their side pod concept, I sort of expected them to go Ferrari Spanish Grand Prix route. But they haven't done that at all, as we see when we look at the rear of the car. They've gone the route of, I think, probably the closest approximation is either Alpine or the Aston Martin. And you can see with the Aston Martin, there's that Ferrari-inspired gully shape, which Aston Martin took much further than Ferrari did and found some great performance gains early in the season. They've dropped back a bit later, a bit more recently, but you've got that very distinctive shape. Compare it alongside the Haas, and you can see exactly those same shapes. Perhaps more Alpine, perhaps more curved. So I would say that Haas have actually copied Aston Martin and Alpine with that shape more than they've copied Red Bull. But that's not to say Haas haven't done any copying of Red Bull. They absolutely have. And you can really see that at with the shape of the side pod inlet. You can see this very distinctive lower lip of the inlet. Now, that's something Red Bull has had for a while. Aston Martin has copied as well. And a few other teams like McLaren have gone the same route. Well, take a look at what Haas turned up at Austin with. It's a slightly different shape, but the concept is there for all to see. Very different, but leading edge of the lower lip is pretty much the same as the Red Bull concept. And when you can compare that to what Haas started the season with, yes, sure, there was a little bit of a protruding lower lip to the side pod duct shape, but it's nothing like what it is now. Haas have gone straight to Red Bull, copied their homework and come up with their own version of it. But this reshaping of the side pod does also take a few other inspirations from Red Bull. Here's how Haas started the season. Look along the top shape of the side pod. It ducks down fairly much like, very similar to the Mercedes axle layout at the rear, but very similar to that Ferrari early season concept. Very slab-sided side pod there, and you can see that quite clearly. Just pay a little bit of attention to the rear stay on the floor there and where it goes to. Well, coming into Austin, the version of the car in this shape, very, very different. And again, this swooping down shape, well, you've seen Red Bull with it for ages. You've seen McLaren copy it, Aston Martin, lots of people. They like that shape. That shape seems to work with this generation of Formula One car. But keep an eye on that stay I was talking about there. You can see it popping out on the bottom of the floor there. But look, it passes right through the bodywork, as one of our producers, Kevin, pointed out to me earlier. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And this is something we have seen on a few other cars this season, those metal floor stays, just to avoid a little bit unwanted floor flexing. So you see it on a lot of cars. But changing the side pod shape so dramatically has been a bit of a challenge for Haas, because they've got to house some of the components that are under these side pods and they haven't been able to change. They haven't really changed the radiator shape. They haven't really spent the time and money to do that. They're going to wait till next year to do that. There's also, towards the back of this side pod shape, I understand from the team, there's some electrical boxes sort of located underneath this section of the car, which they couldn't really relocate at that point of the season. Bit too late in the season to do that. Another thing that you absolutely can't relocate on the car are the side impact structures. To change that, you need to re-homologate the entire chassis, and essentially you're introducing a B-spec or a completely new car at that point. And you can see this bulge. It's a very ugly bulge. It almost looks a bit drag-inducing at the leading edge of the side pod. And that carbon fibre bulge underneath the leading edge of the side pod is the lower side impact structure. Every car has to use them by regulation. There's two, one at the top of the side pod, one lower down, to protect drivers in a side impact collision. Interestingly, every single one of them on the grid is manufactured by Red Bull technology. So whoever wins the race, there's always a bit of Red Bull at the front of the field. You can also take a look at the rear of the car. Now, there's been some really interesting development. I think this is where the really powerful development is going to be coming for Haas. Now, you can see the rear of these dished sections and how it feeds into the space between the inner edge of the rear wheel and the main bulk of the chassis. Take a look at the base of the floor here, how it comes down and is sculpted into a little flick upwards. You can see it really clearly there. That little upward flick, that's new. That may look pretty minor, but it could have an absolutely enormous effect on managing what they call the tyre squirt, a little bit of turbulent air that comes off the bottom of each tyre. When you look at the old version of the car, you can see that they don't have that little flick up. They just have a fairly squared off, almost 90-degree angle. But you can also see how the air would be coming down the side of the car and trying to get into that gap between the tyre and the rest of the bodywork. On the new version, you can see it's a far more complex arrangement. Yeah, the air still comes down the side of the car, but you've got that flick interfering with it. And then you've got this gully and how that feeds in. All of these flow structures will interact with each other to give Haas the effect they're sort of looking for. And then the other big change to the Haas that may have a big effect but doesn't look like very much on the car, it's here to the front brake duct outlet, this little metal piece that sticks out the back of the front brake duct. So all of the air that comes into the front brake ducts, some of it goes to cool the discs and pads inside the wheel, and most of it will come out here at the back of the wheel, because you've got the wheel covers in, you can't really vacate air out of the side of the car because you don't want that outwashing effect. The FIA have stamped down on that. But it looks like just a simple little bit of design, something the team has just done to keep the brakes cool. It's nothing of the sort. All of the teams are mucking around with their brake duct design, not just externally, but also internally. There's all sorts of aerodynamic elements you never get to see inside these channels. And they're mucking around with these air outlets, not just to cool the brakes, but also you can generate a little bit of downforce, but more importantly, it helps them manage the airflow around the car. And you never know, with these little winglets or sticky uppy bits on the front wing, is it helping them generate a little bit of outwash? Well, some people suspect so. We'll see if the FIA allow them to keep them going into 2024. All signs that they are going to remain allowed, but we have heard some noises about the teams going a bit too far on outwash generation, and maybe something the FIA want to take a look at, though it might not happen until 2025. But for Haas, all of these developments are not really to do with the 2023 car. If it improves performance, as it seems to be in Austin, with 5th and 9th in Free Practice 1, well, it could be a good thing. But all of this, it's aimed at 2024, where Haas has a real point to make. And that point is scoring a lot more points than they have this season. Could Haas become a real force in Formula One in the same way that they did in the NASCAR Sprint Cup? We'll have to wait and see.